Welcome to chapters 13 and 14 of our Read Aloud, My Teacher is an Alien. I'm Mr. Lures, and let's get started. Chapter 13, Rumors. Stacy and Mike did a good job, didn't they? Said Peter when we got together on the playground at recess. What are you talking about? I asked. Stacy and Mike. Didn't you think that fight they put on was pretty good? The fight they put on? I echoed. Peter sounded impatient. Stacy and Mike are afraid Broxholm will decide one of them is the best kid in the class, and then try to kidnap whichever one he chooses. So they decided to fake a fight. You know, mess up their reputations a little. All of a sudden everything came clear. That's why Duncan brought Mr. Smith an apple this morning, I said. Peter giggled. Pathetic, isn't it? But it might work. Right now Duncan is a sure pick for worst kid in the class. But if he works really hard, he might actually manage to pull himself out of the bottom of the list. Since he knows that no matter what he does, he's never going to push himself into the most average category, if he can improve at all, he's probably safe. The problem is, he's been so bad all year that it's going to take a major effort to get him off the bottom spot. Peter paused and added, I intend to have some fun with him over the next 3 days. 3 days? That was all the time we had before Broxholm was scheduled to kidnap 5 of us into space. That's not very nice, I started to say. But then I remembered the way Duncan had tormented Peter for the last 6 years. I decided I couldn't blame Peter if he wanted to get a little of his own back while he could. Any decision to be a nice guy about this was going to have to come from inside himself. I decided to change the subject. Tell me, I said, just how did they know about all this? I told them, said Peter. And they believed you? Actually, it made sense. If they were going to believe anyone, it would be Peter. He had a reputation as being the most honest kid in the class, which was one of his problems. He didn't know how to tell the kind of little white lies that keep people from getting mad at you. But I doubted that even his reputation for honesty would convince people this story was true. Peter smiled. Actually, you're the reason anyone believed me. It started with Stacy. She just didn't believe you had really fainted, or that if you had, you would have tried to grab the teacher's ear on the way down. So she knew something was going on. Later she cornered me on the playground and demanded to know what you were up to. Why you? I asked. Peter blushed. You're going to hate this, he said. There's a rumor going around that you're my girlfriend because we've been spending so much time talking on the playground. Yuck, I yelled. Yuck, yuck, yuck. Suddenly I realized what I had just done. Don't take that personally, I said. I won't, said Peter, since I feel the same way. Hey, I thought, what do you mean you feel the same way? But we didn't have time to work out those kind of things right then. Anyway, Peter said, Stacy was convinced. I must know what was going on. And since I did, I told her. The whole story, I gasped? Peter nodded. She didn't believe me at first, of course. But when she talked to you on Saturday and you told her there was nothing actually wrong with you, she figured it must be true. He laughed. That was all it took. By Saturday afternoon, the phone lines were humming all over Kentucket Falls. How come you know all this? I asked. How come no one asked me? Peter shrugged. That's not the way rumors work. People never check with the source. They always ask someone else. Don't ask me why, but it's true. Lots of stupid things are true. Anyway, Stacy told Mike, and Mike told someone else, and that was that. It's the kind of story that travels fast. And they all believe it? I asked. Peter shook his head. I don't think so, at least not yet. Except for Duncan. He's so dim, he'll believe anything. Especially if Stacy and Mike believe it. He thinks they know everything. That's why he hates them so much. I see, I said, though some of this was coming a little too fast for me. Well, do you suppose if enough of us start to believe it, the adults will pay any attention to us? Peter looked as if I had just suggested Mickey Mouse was likely to be the next president of the United States. Get real, Susan, he said. They'll say it's just another crazy kid rumor. Do you remember last year when half the people in this school were convinced that the president was coming to Kentucket Falls to make a speech? I nodded. I'd almost believed it myself. Half because so many of my friends did. Half because I wanted it to be true. I also remember how my father had laughed when he heard about it. Just because 1,000 idiots believe something, that doesn't make it true, he had said. Which was true, I guess, but it certainly didn't help us now. That was when Peter decided to complicate things with a new problem. What are you going to do about this yourself, he asked. What do you mean? Well, since one of the things on Broxholm's shopping list is the best kid in the class, if we can't unmask him, you've got a good chance of being picked yourself. That was the best laugh I'd had in days. You're nuts, I said. There's no way I could be picked for the top kid in class. There is, too. It all depends on how he's making his choice. The way I see it, there are 4 of us that might be considered best in the class. Stacy, Michael, you, and me. You're nuts, I said again. Listen to me. Stacy and Michael are your basic perfect students. But they just did a good job of taking themselves out of the running. Though, to tell you the truth, I don't think Broxholm would have chosen either of them anyway. They're real bright, but they don't think that much. They believe everything the teacher tells them. I'm sure Broxholm is bright enough to know that doesn't make a great student. He paused. Then there's me, he said. I'm real bright, but I'm not motivated. And I'm not very social. You know how it goes. Peter is a good student, but he's not very well-rounded. I hear it every year. That leaves you, Susan. You get good grades. You get along with everyone. You're in all kinds of activities. Let's face it, you might not be the best at any one thing, but when you look at everything together, you make up a pretty good pick for the top of the class. I stared at him in horror. You're not kidding, are you? He shook his head. Chapter 14. What can Duncan Dougal do? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I had been worried that Broxholm might want me for one of his average slots. It never crossed my mind that I could be considered the top student in the class. Peter, what am I going to do? I wailed. Peter shrugged his skinny shoulders. Don't worry, he said. I've got a plan. I thought he meant the camera. He didn't, but I didn't know that then. The plan he actually meant was so weird I never would have thought of it. I took a deep breath and tried to settle down. I'm glad you mentioned that, I said, referring to the camera. I think I've figured out the best time for me to get back into Broxholm's house. You mean us, said Peter. I shook my head. I mean me, I said. I'm going to do it tomorrow morning, during my music lesson time. That way Mr. Smith won't suspect anything when I leave the room. I figure, if I use my bike, I can make it to his house and back before I'm really missed. I'll get in trouble later, but at least I'll have the proof we need. You're not going alone, said Peter. Yes, I am, I said. If we both take off, it's going to look suspicious, especially considering the amount of time we've spent together lately. Maybe suspicious enough that Broxholm will pretend he's sick, just so he can check up on us. We don't want him walking in on us while we're taking the photos. I doubt we can manage to sneak out of his house without getting caught a second time, especially if he's actually looking for us. Then I should go instead, said Peter. You might not have enough time. I'll just skip school altogether. Now how can you do that? I asked. Peter sighed. I keep trying to tell you. It doesn't make any difference what I do. As long as I don't get in trouble with the law, no one cares. Peter, that's not a very nice way to talk about your parents, I said. I don't have parents, he snapped. I've got a parent. Period. He doesn't care what I do, as long as I don't get in trouble. I felt stupid. Here I had known this kid for 6 years, and I didn't even know he only had one parent. All right, I said. We'll go together. Why don't I just go alone, said Peter. I shook my head. I got this whole thing started. It's my job. Actually, I wasn't feeling all that noble. I wanted to see Miss Swartz again, to make sure she was okay, and also get some advice. Peter shrugged. You're the one who's going to land in hot water. If that's the way you want it, it's fine. It's okay with me. It was time to go back inside. Even though the major weirdness was over for the day, you could sense a kind of nervous energy in the classroom. The other kids really didn't believe the rumors about Mr. Smith being an alien. At least not yet. But after the little show Stacy and Mike had put on, they were starting to take things pretty seriously. It would have been funny if it wasn't so scary. The next morning, I rode my bike to school, carrying my piccolo and camera in my backpack. As I was putting the lock on my front wheel, Duncan Dougal came sliding up to me and said, If you and Peter are pulling some kind of joke on me, I'm going to turn you into peanut butter." Strange as it may seem, Duncan's threat made me feel better. At least I knew there were some things in the world that I could still count on. "It's no joke, Duncan," I said, drawing a cross over my heart with my fingers. He looked at me suspiciously. Then he nodded. "Okay," he said. "Now what are we going to do about it?" Now that was something I hadn't expected. An offer of help from Duncan Dougal. Think quick, I told myself. This may not happen again for another 10 years. I looked at Duncan. "How would you feel about skipping school today?" I asked. He grinned, showing the big gap between his front teeth. "I love skipping school," he said. He wasn't telling me something I didn't know. One of the things that made it possible to survive having Duncan in our class was the fact he was out of school so often. We all knew his older brother wrote his excuses for him, but none of us were about to tell. We weren't crazy enough to do something that would put Duncan in our classroom any more often than was necessary. Besides, if one of us told, and Duncan found out who did it, he would massacre that person. But it might be useful to have him along. If I could be sure of one other thing. "Can you go someplace with Peter without picking on him?" I asked. "Sure," said Duncan. "I like Peter." I looked at him. To my astonishment, he looked like he really meant it. I shook my head. What can you say to someone like that? "All right," I said. "You go do whatever it is you do when you skip school. I'm going to sneak out of the building at 9:15. I want you to meet me at the corner of Pine and Parker. You'll need a bike." I thought about telling him not to steal it, but decided that might seem too insulting. Duncan nodded his head. "Where are we going?" he asked. I looked him right in the eye and said, "Peter and I are going to break into Mr. Smith's house and take pictures of the force field where he's holding Mrs. Swartz prisoner. I want you to stand outside and be our lookout, in case Mr. Smith gets wise and comes back to stop us." I hesitated, then added, "I hope you won't mind facing an alien death ray." I suppose that was a rotten thing to say, but the look on Duncan's face made it worth it. And that's the end of chapters 13 and 14 of My Teacher is an Alien. Come back next time to hear the next couple chapters. As for me, I'm Mr. Lures saying have a great day, friends.